I was sitting at the long dining table in my mother-in-law, Margaret Adams's house, when she leaned back in her chair, looked directly at me, and said in a calm voice that carried easily across the room, "Sarah is completely useless," and I remember the exact second those words landed because my fork froze halfway between my plate and my mouth, and the green beans I had spent hours preparing went cold in the air. The chandelier above us cast a soft yellow light that suddenly felt harsh and exposing, and for a moment I wondered if I had misheard her, if my mind had twisted something smaller into something crueler. But then I saw her expression, the faint smile at the corner of her mouth, the certainty in her eyes, and I knew she had meant every word. My name is Sarah Adams. I was 29 years old that winter, and I had been married to her son David Adams for 4 years of trying to be polite, agreeable, quiet, 4 years of telling myself that respect would eventually be returned if I gave enough of it first, and now here I was being stripped of dignity in front of his entire family as if I were a defective object being discussed. For return, the table was full. David sat to my right, his father across from us, two of his cousins and an aunt further down, plates full, glasses half empty, everyone perfectly capable of hearing what had just been said. Yet no one spoke. The silence pressed against my chest until it was hard to breathe. I glanced down at my plate at the roast chicken I had helped prepare at the gravy boat Margaret had corrected me on twice, and then I looked up at David, my husband, the man who had promised to love and protect me, who had once told me he would never let anyone treat me badly, and he was staring at his plate as if it contained something fascinating. His jaw tight, his hands steady, still cutting his food. I waited just a second, just long enough for him to say something simple, something human, something like that is not okay, but nothing came. Instead, Margaret continued, her voice smooth and confident. "I do not know what you do all day, Sarah, but it clearly is not contributing anything meaningful to this family. A wife should add value, not create tension." My face burned. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure everyone could hear it, and still, David said nothing. I finally found my voice and asked quietly, "Margaret, what exactly do you mean by that?" And she tilted her head, amused as if I were a child who had asked a foolish question. "I mean that my son could have done much better," she said, and before I could respond, before I could even process the humiliation curling through my stomach, David exhaled sharply and said, "Sarah, please do not start. It is Christmas. Do not turn this into a scene." That was the moment something inside me cracked. Not loudly, not dramatically, but cleanly, like a bone finally giving way after being stressed for too long. I looked at him, really looked at him, and asked, "Did you hear what your mother just said to me?" And he finally met my eyes, irritation flashing across his face, and said, "She is entitled to her opinion. You need to stop being so sensitive." The word sensitive felt like a slap. Margaret smiled then openly now because she had won, and I understood with devastating clarity that this was not about one dinner or one insult. This was about years of silence, years of swallowing my discomfort, years of believing that if I were patient enough, quiet enough, good enough, I would earn my place. And in that moment, sitting under that chandelier with my food untouched and my dignity in pieces, I realized that my husband was not going to defend me. Not now, not ever, and when he added, "If you cannot respect my mother, maybe you should step outside and calm down," something settled inside me heavy and final. Because he was not asking me to take a break, he was choosing her publicly, deliberately. And as I pushed my chair back and stood up with shaking legs, I knew this dinner was about to cost him far more than he expected, even if he did not realize it yet. When I stood up from the table, the legs of my chair scraped loudly against the hardwood floor, the sound sharp and jarring in the heavy silence that followed, and for a brief, irrational moment, I expected someone to stop me, to say this had gone too far, to acknowledge that a line had been crossed, but no one did. Margaret folded her napkin with deliberate care, as if this were all proceeding exactly as planned. David's father kept his eyes fixed on his plate. His cousins stared at their glasses, and David looked up at me, not with concern, but with exasperation, as though I were the one embarrassing him. "Where are you going, Sarah?" he asked, his tone low and warning. I swallowed and said calmly, "You told me to step outside, so I am stepping outside," and even as I said it, I could hear how reasonable I sounded, how controlled, how far I had traveled emotionally in just a few minutes. Margaret let out a soft laugh then, the kind that pretends to be light-hearted but carries a blade underneath it. "See, David," she said, "this is exactly what I mean. She cannot handle even the slightest criticism. Everything has to be about her feelings." David nodded once slowly as if she had just confirmed something he already believed and said, "Mom is right, Sarah. You always do this. You escalate things." My hands curled into fists at my sides. "Always do what I asked," my voice shaking despite my effort to keep it steady. "Speak up when I am insulted." He sighed heavily, the same sigh I had heard so many times before. The sigh that suggested exhaustion and martyrdom, and said, "This is my mother's house. It is Christmas, and you are making everyone uncomfortable. Why can you not just let things go for once?" The word uncomfortable echoed in my head. I wondered what he thought humiliation felt like, what he thought it felt like to be reduced to nothing in front of people you were supposed to call family. Margaret leaned forward slightly, resting her elbows on the table. Her eyes locked on mine and said, "If you were a better wife, Sarah, these situations would not keep happening. My son has enough stress without having to manage your emotions, too." Something hot and dangerous flared in my chest then. But before I could speak, David stood up abruptly, his chair knocking back, and pointed toward the hallway. "Go outside," he said, his voice sharper now, calmer. "Or just leave, I do not care. Just stop this." The word leave hung in the air, heavy and unmistakable. It was not a suggestion, it was a dismissal. And in that second, I understood that this was not a misunderstanding or a moment of poor judgment. This was a choice, clear and intentional. He was choosing his mother's comfort over my dignity, his image over my pain. And as I looked at him, really looked at him, I saw no hesitation, no conflict, only irritation that I had forced him into this position. I felt my throat tighten, and I said quietly, "You are asking me to leave because I was just called useless," and he did not deny it. He simply shrugged and said, "You are overreacting. You can apologize later." The word apologize broke something in me because it meant he expected me to accept this treatment, to absorb it, to smooth it over so his life could return to normal. Margaret leaned back again, satisfied, her arms crossed loosely, watching me like a judge awaiting a verdict, and I realized then that this scene had played out before. Not with me, perhaps, but with other women. Other moments, other lines drawn and erased, and that David knew exactly how this ended with me retreating, apologizing, shrinking myself to fit into a space that was never meant for me, except this time, something was different. I felt it clearly, like a switch flipping off. I picked up my coat from the back of the chair, my hands trembling now, and said nothing else because there was nothing left to explain. David shook his head in frustration and muttered, "You are being dramatic, but he did not follow me. He did not reach for me. He did not ask me to stay." And as I walked toward the front door with my heart pounding and my vision blurring, I understood that the real betrayal was not what his mother had said. It was that the man I married had stood beside me and let it happen, and in doing so had made it unmistakably clear where I stood in his life. I paused at the front door with my hand resting on the cold brass handle. Not because I hoped someone would stop me, but because my body needed a moment to catch up with what my mind had already decided behind me. The dining room remained unnervingly calm. Plates clinked softly. Someone cleared their throat. Margaret's voice resumed a casual conversation, as if nothing extraordinary had happened, as if I had not just been dismantled in front of everyone who mattered to my husband. I turned slightly, just enough to take in the scene one last time. David had already sat back down, his shoulders relaxed, his problem seemingly solved now that I was no longer at the table, and that image settled something deep inside me with a finality that surprised me. There was no anger left in that moment, no urge to defend myself, no desire to explain how deeply wrong this was. There was only a quiet clarity, the kind that arrives when every excuse has been exhausted and every illusion stripped away. I realized then that I had spent years waiting for a version of my husband who did not exist. A man who would stand up, who would draw a line, who would choose me without hesitation, and I saw with painful honesty that he never had and never would. The door opened easily under my hand, letting in a rush of cold winter air that made me inhale sharply. The night outside was dark and still, the porch light casting a weak yellow circle on the steps. And as I stepped out, the door closed behind me with a soft, definitive click. No footsteps followed. No voice called my name, and that silence spoke louder than anything said at the table. I stood there for a few seconds, my breath forming small white clouds in front of me, listening, waiting for something I already knew would not come. And in that waiting, I felt the last fragile thread of hope dissolve. I walked slowly to my car, each step measured, deliberate, my legs unsteady but carrying me forward anyway. When I reached the driver's seat and closed the door, the familiar interior smelled faintly of old coffee and the lavender air freshener I had hung months ago. A small detail that felt suddenly intimate and grounding. I rested my forehead against the steering wheel and closed my eyes, not to cry but to steady myself. My hands were shaking now, adrenaline finally catching up, but underneath it was something else, something heavier and calmer, an understanding that this moment had been inevitable, that this dinner had simply exposed what had been true for a long time. I was not leaving because of one cruel sentence. I was leaving because of every time I had been dismissed, minimized, and made to feel like a burden for wanting basic respect. Memories surfaced uninvited. David's voice telling me to lower my tone, to stop overreacting, to keep the peace. The way his presence would loom too close during arguments, blocking doorways, slamming his palm against the wall beside my head, never hitting me, never leaving marks, but making sure I understood how small I was allowed to be, how quickly things could escalate if I pushed too hard. I had told myself those moments did not count, that other women had it worse, that this was just stress, just frustration, just his temper. But sitting there alone in the cold, I finally let myself name it for what it was: control intimidation, a slow erosion of safety disguised as normal marital conflict. My chest tightened as that realization settled in, not as panic, but as resolve, because if I stayed, if I went back inside that house, or returned to the life waiting for me afterward, this would not get better. It would only become easier for him, easier to silence me, easier to excuse his behavior, easier to convince me that I deserved it. I started the engine, the sound loud in the quiet street, and as the headlights cut through the darkness ahead of me, I made a decision that felt both terrifying and inevitable. I was not stepping outside to calm down, and I was not coming back to apologize. The door that had been closing inside me for years had finally shut, and for the first time, I did not feel like I was losing something. I felt like I was finally letting myself go. I drove away from Margaret's house with my hands locked tight around the steering wheel. My shoulders rigid, my jaw clenched so hard my teeth ached, the neighborhood sliding past in a blur of quiet houses and dark windows, Christmas lights glowing softly behind curtains, scenes of warmth and belonging that felt impossibly distant from the cold clarity settling in my chest. The heater hummed, but my fingers stayed numb, and with every mile I put between myself and that dining room, another layer of denial peeled away, because once I was alone, truly alone, there was nothing left to soften the truth. I was not being dramatic, I was not too sensitive, and I was not imagining a pattern that did not exist. What had happened tonight was simply the most visible expression of something that had been shaping my life for years. I pulled into a nearly empty parking lot near a closed grocery store and turned off the engine, the sudden silence ringing in my ears. My reflection stared back at me from the dark windshield. Pale eyes too bright, a woman I barely recognized, and as I sat there, memories I had carefully minimized began to surface with an insistence I could no longer ignore the arguments that never quite felt safe, the way David's voice would drop when he was angry, slow and controlled, how he would stand too close, forcing me to step back. How he would block the hallway or the bedroom door, insisting we finish the conversation while his presence pressed in on me like a warning. He never hit me, not once. And I had used that fact as proof that things were not that bad, but there were nights when his hand would slam into the wall beside my head, leaving a dent in the drywall and my heart racing, long after he walked away. Nights when he would grab my wrist too tightly and then release it with a scoff, telling me I was exaggerating. When I flinched, I had learned to stay calm, to keep my voice low, to agree quickly so the tension would dissipate, and I told myself this was what compromise looked like. That all marriages had moments like this, that I was lucky he had never crossed a line he could not explain away. But sitting in that car, I finally understood how narrow and dangerous that logic had been, because the line kept moving and I had been moving with it, shrinking my expectations, my reactions, my sense of what was acceptable, until being publicly humiliated felt like just another thing I was expected to endure. The realization hit me slowly, but with undeniable force. If I stayed, if I went back to the life waiting for me after tonight, this would escalate not necessarily into bruises or broken bones, but into something just as destructive. A complete erasure of my voice, my autonomy, my sense of safety in my own home. I rested my forehead against the steering wheel and finally allowed myself to cry. Not loud sobs, but silent tears that slipped down my face and soaked into the collar of my coat. Grief for the years I had spent excusing what should never have been excused. Grief for the woman I had been before I learned to make myself smaller. And beneath that grief, something steadier began to form, an understanding that leaving was not an overreaction. It was a necessary act of self-preservation. I checked my phone, then half expecting a message from David, some sign of concern or regret, but the screen was empty, and that absence told me more than any words could have. He was not worried about where I was or whether I was safe. He was relieved that the disruption had been removed, and that knowledge settled my resolve into something unshakable. I started the car again and pulled back onto the road, this time with a destination in mind. A small motel near the highway I had passed a dozen times without ever noticing. It was not a dramatic escape. There were no bags packed, no plan laid out, just a clear understanding that going back was no longer an option as the motel sign came into view, flickering slightly against the dark sky. I felt the weight of fear and uncertainty pressing in. But alongside it was something new. A quiet determination, because for the first time I was not measuring my choices by how they would be received by David or his mother. I was measuring them by one simple question: would this keep me safe? And as I pulled into the parking lot and turned off the engine once more, I knew with absolute certainty that tonight had not been the end of my marriage. Because of one dinner, it had been the moment I finally acknowledged the danger of staying and chose to walk away before there was nothing left of me to save. When I think back to the beginning of my relationship with David Adams, I almost struggle to reconcile that version of him with the man who had just asked me to leave his mother's house as if I were an inconvenience. Because when we met, I was 25 and certain of who I was. I had my own small apartment, a steady job, close friends, and a sense of independence I had worked hard to build. David came into my life gently, patiently, with an attentiveness that felt reassuring rather than overwhelming. We met through mutual friends at a casual weekend gathering, and he listened. When I spoke, really listened, asking questions, remembering details, making me feel seen in a way that was both flattering and disarming. He told me early on that his family was close, that his mother Margaret had sacrificed a lot for him after his father struggled with his health and work, and he spoke about her with a mixture of loyalty and caution that I misread as maturity. When I met her for the first time, she was polite, almost warm, complimenting my appearance, asking about my background, telling me how relieved she was that David had found someone nice. I remember leaving that first dinner thinking I had gotten lucky, that the stories about difficult mothers-in-law did not apply to me, that I had found a man who valued family without being controlled by it. The shift began so subtly that I did not recognize it as a warning sign. After we got engaged, David started making small suggestions framed as concern. Maybe you should call my mother more often. She worries about us. Maybe you could adjust your work schedule once we are married. Marriage is about compromise. Maybe you could let her help decorate the apartment. She has good taste and wants to feel included. None of it sounded unreasonable on its own, and I agreed because I wanted peace. Because I loved him, because I believed flexibility was part of building a future together. When we got married, Margaret became more present, not overtly hostile, just constantly involved, dropping by unannounced, commenting on how I cooked, how I cleaned, how I spoke, always with a smile that made it difficult to challenge her without looking ungrateful. David brushed off my discomfort, telling me she meant well, that she was just particular, that I needed to be more patient. And when I tried to explain how small her comments made me feel, he would laugh lightly and say, "You are reading too much into it. She likes you, do not start imagining problems where there are none." I wanted to believe him, so I did. I told myself I was lucky to have a husband who cared about harmony, who wanted everyone to get along, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, I began adjusting myself to fit the version of wife that made his life easier. I postponed career opportunities because the timing was never quite right. I stopped inviting friends over because Margaret did not like unexpected guests. I learned which topics to avoid at family gatherings and how to phrase my opinions so they sounded less like opinions and more like questions. Each compromise felt small, temporary, justified by love. And I kept telling myself that once things settled, once we found our rhythm, once Margaret relaxed, things would feel balanced again, but balance never came. Instead, the space where I used to stand grew narrower, and the man who had once made me feel safe began to treat my discomfort as a flaw to be corrected, rather than a signal to be respected. Looking back, now I can see how carefully the foundation was laid, how easily affection turned into expectation, and how love was slowly conditioned on my willingness to stay quiet, agreeable, and grateful. But at the time, all I saw was a marriage. I was determined to make work, and a future I believed was still within reach if I just tried a little harder, unaware that the very effort to hold everything together was quietly erasing the person I had been when David first told me he loved me. After the wedding, the changes did not arrive all at once. They crept in quietly, disguised as reasonable expectations and family values, and because they came wrapped in familiar language, I accepted them without realizing how much ground I was losing. David began encouraging me to reduce my work hours, not demanding it outright, just suggesting that a calmer schedule would be better for our marriage, better for our future children, better for keeping his mother from worrying. And when I hesitated, he framed it as a choice I was making for us, not something he was asking of me. Margaret reinforced this narrative at every opportunity, praising women who put their families first, making pointed comments about wives who chased careers instead of stability, always careful to speak in general terms while looking directly at me, and each time I tried to push back, David would intervene, not to defend me, but to smooth things over for her, telling me later that I needed to be more understanding, that his mother came from a different generation, that I was taking things too personally. The phrase "too sensitive" became a constant refrain, and I started hearing it in my own head before I spoke, questioning my reactions, minimizing my hurt, telling myself that conflict was a sign of failure rather than a signal that something was wrong. As my world narrowed, David's temper became more visible, not explosive, but controlled, precise. His anger expressed through proximity and tone rather than shouting. He would stand too close when we argued, forcing me to step back until my shoulders hit the wall, his voice low and steady as he explained why I was wrong, why I had misunderstood, why my memory of events could not be trusted. And if I tried to walk away, he would block the doorway, insisting we finish the conversation. His hand braced against the frame, his body a barrier I was not meant to cross afterward. He would apologize lightly, saying he just hated unresolved issues, that I should not make him push so hard to be heard, and I would accept it, relieved when the tension eased, unaware that my relief was becoming a reward for compliance. Margaret's influence grew alongside this shift. She criticized how I kept the house, how I dressed, how I spoke to David, always positioning herself as an authority on what a good wife looked like. And when I tried to assert myself, David accused me of disrespecting her, of embarrassing him, of creating unnecessary drama. I began preparing for family gatherings, like a performance, rehearsing my responses, monitoring my tone, scanning Margaret's expressions for signs of approval or displeasure, and each small success in avoiding conflict came at the cost of another piece of myself. Friends noticed the change before I did, commenting on how tired I seemed, how guarded, how I always checked my phone before making plans, but I dismissed their concerns, repeating David's words as if they were my own. Marriage is hard. Families are complicated. Everyone has to compromise. What I did not say, what I could not yet admit, was how often I felt afraid in my own home. Not of being hurt physically, but of triggering his anger, of misstepping in ways that would lead to hours of tension and correction. The wall dents appeared one by one, evidence of arguments he insisted were normal. The grip marks on my wrist faded quickly, leaving nothing tangible to point to, and because there were no visible bruises, no broken objects, no dramatic scenes, I told myself it was not abuse, just stress, just personality differences, just a marriage going through a phase. But the truth was that my sense of safety had been steadily eroded, replaced by vigilance and self-monitoring, and by the time Margaret called me useless at that dinner, I had already been conditioned to doubt my right to object, to question my own worth, to believe that harmony was my responsibility alone, and that speaking up was the real offense. This was not a sudden collapse. It was the inevitable outcome of years spent shrinking myself to fit into a space defined by control. Silence and fear dressed up as love. The motel room smelled faintly of detergent and stale air, the kind of place people passed without noticing, but that night it felt like a refuge. I closed the door behind me, slid the deadbolt into place, and leaned my back against it, as if the thin wood were a shield. My knees weakened all at once, and I sank onto the edge of the bed, the floral comforter rough beneath my palms, the heater rattling in the corner as it struggled against the cold. And for the first time since I had left Margaret's house, I let myself break. The tears came fast and without warning, hot and uncontrollable, my shoulders shaking as years of swallowed pain finally forced its way out. I cried for the woman I had been when I married David. Hopeful and certain, I cried for the way I had learned to measure my words, my movements, my very presence to avoid setting him off, and I cried for the humiliation of that dinner, for the sound of his voice telling me to leave as if I were the problem that needed to be removed. The sobbing left me exhausted, hollowed out, and when it finally slowed, I lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to my own breathing. Something shifted inside me, then quietly but unmistakably. The sadness did not disappear, but it was joined by something else, something sharper and steadier. Anger, not the kind that makes you scream or throw things, but a cold, clarifying anger that cut through the fog I had been living in. I replayed the dinner in my mind. Margaret's smile, David's shrug, the way he had framed my humiliation as an inconvenience to be managed. And for the first time, I did not ask myself what I could have done differently. I asked a different question. Why had I been expected to endure this at all? The answer was as simple as it was devastating, because I had been trained to, because every time I stayed quiet, every time I apologized, every time I accepted his version of events over my own instincts, I reinforced the idea that my comfort was optional, expendable. I sat up and looked around the room at the scratched dresser, the single lamp, the closed curtains, and I realized how rare it felt to be alone without feeling watched, corrected, or judged. The silence here was different. It did not feel heavy or threatening. It felt neutral, safe. My phone buzzed on the nightstand and I flinched before I even checked it, my body reacting faster than my mind. But it was only a notification from the front desk confirming my stay. No messages from David, no missed calls, and that absence stoked the anger further because it confirmed what I had already sensed. He was not worried about me. He was waiting for me to return, to calm down, to apologize, to restore order. I stood up and walked to the small bathroom mirror, barely recognizing the woman staring back at me. My eyes were red, my face drawn, but beneath the exhaustion there was something new, a firmness I had not seen in years. I thought about what would happen if I went back. The explanations, I would offer the compromises. I would make the promises he would half give and half retract. And I felt a surge of certainty so strong it startled me. If I went back, now this would escalate the control, would tighten the intimidation, would become easier, because he would know that even this level of cruelty was survivable for me, and that knowledge terrified me more than the idea of leaving. I sat back down on the bed and took a deep breath, feeling the anger settle into resolve. I was done negotiating my safety, done proving my worth to people who benefited from my silence. This motel room, temporary and unremarkable as it was, had given me something I had not felt in a long time perspective, and with it came a promise I made to myself in that quiet space. I would not go back to a life where fear and humiliation were the price of belonging, no matter how uncertain the alternative might be. I woke the next morning in that motel room with a dull ache behind my eyes and a strange sense of calm, the kind that comes after a decision has already been made. Even if the consequences are still unclear, the winter light filtered through the thin curtains, pale and honest, and for a moment I simply lay there listening to the muted sounds of traffic outside, reminding myself where I was and why my phone lay face down on the nightstand, and when I finally picked it up, there were 3 missed calls and a short message from David sent hours earlier asking where I had gone and telling me not to make this harder than it needed to be. There was no apology, no concern for my safety, just irritation that I had disrupted the pattern. I set the phone aside and went to shower, letting the hot water run over my shoulders until the tension eased slightly, telling myself that whatever came next, I would face it with clarity. It was mid-morning when my phone rang again, this time from a number I did not recognize. I almost ignored it, but something made me answer. "Sarah Adams," a woman asked cautiously, her voice low and measured. "This is Linda Harris. I am a friend of the family. We have met once or twice over the years." I hesitated, searching my memory, then placed her. Linda was a neighbor from David's childhood home, someone who attended holidays and barbecues, but never seemed fully part of Margaret's inner circle. "Yes, I remember you," I said, and she exhaled softly as if relieved. "I am calling because I heard what happened last night, and because I think you deserve to know something." The weight in her tone made my stomach tighten. I sat down on the edge of the bed and told her I was listening. Linda did not rush her words. She chose them carefully, as if she had rehearsed this conversation in her head many times. "Margaret has done this before." She said not exactly like this, but close enough that I recognized it immediately. My heart began to pound. "What do you mean?" I asked. She told me about another woman David had been serious about. Years before we met a woman named Emily who had dated him for nearly 3 years. Linda explained that Margaret had never approved of her, that she criticized her constantly, questioned her intentions, and eventually began planting doubts in David's mind, telling him Emily was manipulative, unstable, not good enough for him, and David, according to Linda, had repeated those words almost verbatim when he finally ended the relationship, claiming it was better for everyone. Linda paused then, and when she continued, her voice was tight with frustration. "What she did not tell you. Sarah is what happened afterward. Emily did not just walk away, she fell apart. She left town, quit her job, needed therapy for months. And Margaret told people it proved she had been right all along." I felt a chill move through me, the parallels impossible to ignore. Linda went on, explaining that Margaret viewed any woman close to David as a threat, someone who might weaken her influence over him, and that David had grown up learning that pleasing his mother meant stability and approval, while challenging her meant conflict and withdrawal. He learned early on that it was easier to let her win, even if it cost someone else. My throat tightened as Linda added the final piece, "The one that made my hands shake last night after you left. David said something that worried me. He laughed and told his cousin that you would be back, that you always calmed down, and then he said, 'She does not really have anywhere else to go.'" I felt the words land like a blow to the chest, not because they were cruel, but because they confirmed every fear I had been pushing aside. He believed I was trapped, that my leaving was temporary, performative, a tantrum that would resolve itself once I remembered my place. Linda apologized, then telling me she should have reached out sooner, that she had hoped things would change, but that last night had convinced her they would not. She also warned me that Margaret was already controlling the narrative, telling relatives that I was unstable, overly emotional, that I had abandoned David over a harmless comment. As I listened, the righteous anger I had felt the night before sharpened into something more focused, more deliberate. This was not just a toxic dynamic, it was a system one designed to isolate, discredit, and control. And I had been living inside it without realizing how carefully it had been constructed. When Linda finished, she told me she would support me if I needed someone to speak the truth, that I was not imagining any of this, and that leaving did not make me weak. It made me aware. I thanked her and ended the call. Sitting in the quiet motel room as the full weight of what I had learned settled in the humiliation at dinner had not been an accident, and David's indifference had not been confusion. It had been confidence. Confidence that I would return, apologize, and allow the story to be rewritten without me. And as I stared at my phone, I understood with chilling clarity that if I did not act decisively now, I would disappear into that narrative completely. Just another woman who could not handle the family. Another cautionary tale Margaret would use to reinforce her control, and in that moment, I made a choice that would change everything. I would not just leave quietly. I would remove myself so completely that there would be no version of this story where I stayed. I returned to the house 2 days later in the middle of the afternoon, choosing the hour deliberately because I knew David would be at work and Margaret would not dare show up unannounced while neighbors were awake, and watching the driveway was empty when I pulled in the front of the house, quiet and ordinary, and for a moment I stood there with my keys in my hand, feeling the familiar pull to rush to get in and out before the anxiety caught up with me, but I forced myself to slow down. This was not an escape, it was a retrieval. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air smelled faintly of David's cologne and the lemon cleaner Margaret favored, a scent combination that had always made the place feel less like a home and more like a showroom I was never allowed to rearrange. I set my purse down and took a steadying breath, reminding myself of the rule I had made in that motel room, only what was mine. Nothing to negotiate, nothing to justify. I started in the bedroom, pulling my suitcase from the closet, the same one I had used when I moved in after the wedding, and that detail struck me harder than I expected, as if the house itself had never quite acknowledged my permanence. I packed methodically, folding clothes with care, placing shoes side by side, ignoring the framed photos of David and his family that lined the dresser. I moved to the bathroom next, gathering my toiletries, my makeup, the small box of keepsakes I kept under the sink, and I noticed how quickly the space emptied once my things were gone. How little of it had ever belonged to me. The living room took longer, not because there was more to pack, but because I had learned to keep my presence there. Minimal. My books were stacked on a single shelf, my throw blanket folded neatly over the arm of a chair. I rarely chose. I packed those items slowly, each one a quiet reclamation. The kitchen was the last room I entered, and the contrast there was stark. Nearly everything in it had been chosen by Margaret, the cookware, the dishware, even the arrangement of the cabinets. I took only what I had brought into the marriage, a few mixing bowls that had belonged to my grandmother, a coffee mug chipped at the rim that David had once mocked for being sentimental. And I left the rest untouched because this was not about punishment. It was about truth. I had arranged for a moving company that offered same-day service, explaining my situation briefly without details. And when they arrived, 2 men in plain jackets who did not ask questions, I felt a surge of gratitude. I had not expected they moved efficiently, carrying box after box down the front steps while I checked rooms to make sure nothing of mine was left behind. With every trip they made, the house felt less oppressive, less like a place that had held me captive. When the truck doors finally closed, I walked back inside one last time. The rooms echoed slightly now, stripped of the few personal touches I had been allowed to keep, and I realized how symbolic the emptiness was. This was what my absence would look like. Not dramatic, not destructive, just unmistakable. I went to the kitchen counter and removed my wedding ring, the diamond catching the light from the window in a way that felt almost mocking. I held it for a long moment, thinking about the promises attached to it. Promises that had been broken quietly and repeatedly. Then I placed it on the counter where David would see it immediately. No note, no explanation. Just the object itself, a clear and final punctuation mark as I locked the door behind me and walked to my car. My chest felt tight but steady. The fear I had expected was there, but it was muted by something stronger relief. I drove directly to a small storage facility on the edge of town, unloaded the boxes with the help of the same movers, and watched the unit door roll down with a hollow metallic sound that felt oddly satisfying when I left. My phone buzzed for the first time since I had started packing a text from David that read, "Where are you? We need to talk." I did not respond. I turned the phone face down and drove away because the conversation he wanted would not be about accountability or remorse. It would be about restoring the order he depended on, and that order no longer included me. When David came home that evening, he would open the door, expecting a quiet house and an uncomfortable conversation, and instead, he would find something far more destabilizing: absence, not staged, not temporary, but complete. And for the first time in our marriage, the silence would not be mine to endure. The messages started less than an hour after David got home. At first confused and irritated, then sharp and demanding my phone, lighting up on the passenger seat. As I drove to the small apartment I had arranged through a coworker, I did not answer. I did not slow down, and I did not explain, because I knew from experience how quickly explanations became weapons in his hands. The first message asked where I had put my things. The second accused me of being childish. The third warned me not to make a mistake I would regret, and with each vibration of my phone, my body reacted before my mind could intervene, my shoulders tensing, my breath shortening, the familiar instinct to appease rising up like muscle memory. I turned the phone off completely, then, not out of spite, but out of self-preservation, because I could already feel the old pattern trying to reassert itself, the need to calm him down, to manage his emotions so mine could be safe. That night, I slept lightly on a borrowed mattress, every sound outside the door pulling me halfway awake, but even through the exhaustion, there was a thin thread of relief running through me, the kind that comes from distance. The next morning, the phone was full again, voicemails this time, David's voice shifting with each one. The first clipped and annoyed, telling me I had gone too far. The second pleading, asking me to come home so we could talk like adults. The third, darker. His tone low and controlled, warning me not to embarrass him by involving other people. That message made my stomach drop because I recognized the edge in it. The same edge I had heard when he blocked doorways, when his hand struck the wall beside my head, never touching me but making the message unmistakable. I did not call him back. Instead, I told my supervisor at work that I was going through a personal emergency and might need flexibility, and to my surprise, she did not question me or press for details. She simply said she hoped I was safe and asked how she could help. That small kindness nearly undid me because it stood in such stark contrast to the minimization I had grown used to by the afternoon David had escalated again, showing up at my workplace unannounced. Security intercepted him in the lobby after he raised his voice and demanded to see me. I learned about it later from a colleague who checked on me with concern in her eyes, telling me he had seemed agitated and unwilling to leave the image of him there, bringing his anger into a space where I had once felt competent and respected, sent a chill through me. And for the first time, I allowed myself to fully acknowledge how close I had been to real danger. Not because he had already crossed the worst lines, but because he felt entitled to my presence, my compliance, my silence. And now that those things were gone, his frustration had nowhere to go. That realization hardened my resolve. I contacted a local domestic violence hotline that evening, my voice shaking as I explained that my husband had never hit me but had intimidated me, controlled my movements, and was now escalating his behavior. The woman on the line listened without interrupting and then said something that settled heavily in my chest. Abuse does not start with bruises. It starts with fear. She helped me make a safety plan, advising me to vary my routines, to keep my location private, to document his messages, and to trust the instinct that had gotten me out after the call. I sat alone in the quiet apartment, the borrowed furniture sparse but clean, and felt the weight of what could have happened press in on me if I had gone back, if I had apologized, if I had allowed the story to reset. David's behavior would not have softened it, would have intensified, because control, once challenged, does not retreat quietly. It lashes out that night. Another message came through from an unknown number, a single sentence that made my hands go cold. "You are ruining everything. Come home." Now I blocked it immediately and forwarded it to the advocate I had spoken with. My fear was real, but it was no longer paralyzing. It was informative, guiding me toward caution rather than submission. And as I locked the door and sat on the floor with my back against it, breathing steadily until my heartbeat slowed, I understood something with absolute clarity. Leaving had not created this escalation, it had revealed it, and by stepping away when I did, I had interrupted a path that could have led somewhere far darker. The house he came home to had been empty, but the life he had taken for granted was collapsing, and for the first time, the danger he represented no longer had access to me. The weeks that followed unfolded with a strange mix of urgency and distance, as if my life were split into two parallel tracks. One focused on immediate safety and logistics, the other finally free enough to process what had happened. I met with a family law attorney recommended by a colleague, a calm woman in her 50s who listened carefully as I described the marriage, the intimidation, the public humiliation, and the escalation after I left. She did not interrupt or question my memory. She asked practical questions, took notes, and then told me plainly that leaving when I did had likely prevented far worse outcomes. We filed for divorce shortly after citing emotional abuse and intimidation, and I began the methodical work of documenting everything. Messages, voicemails, dates, witnesses, a paper trail that replaced the confusion David had relied on for years. Linda Harris agreed to provide a statement describing what she had witnessed over time, including David's comments after I left his mother's house. A neighbor from our street confirmed hearing arguments late at night and seeing damage to the wall near our front door. Small pieces of truth assembling into a larger picture that no longer depended on my voice alone. Margaret responded exactly as Linda had predicted. She called relatives, friends, anyone who would listen, telling them I had abandoned her son, that I was unstable, dramatic, incapable of commitment, but the narrative did not land the way it once might have. Too many people had seen the messages, heard the accounts, noticed the pattern, and her certainty began to sound shrill rather than authoritative. David attempted to regain control through legal channels, contesting the filing, requesting mediation, demanding explanations. But when faced with documentation and witnesses, his confidence faltered. His attorney advised him to settle, warning that a public hearing would expose details he could not spin away. The settlement was fair and final assets divided cleanly. No shared property to argue over. No lingering ties to exploit. The marriage ended quietly, without the spectacle he had once relied on to keep me in line outside the legal process. The consequences continued to ripple outward. David moved back into his childhood home with Margaret, a regression that did not go unnoticed by his peers. His behavior at work deteriorated as well. Reports of anger, missed deadlines, conflicts he could no longer manage. Once I was not there to absorb the impact, within months, he lost the position he had used as proof of his stability, and without me to organize, soothe, and excuse the life he had built around control, began to unravel. Margaret's social circle shrank as well. Invitations slowed, conversations cooled. People who had once deferred to her authority began to distance themselves quietly, not out of confrontation but out of discomfort with what had been revealed. I heard these updates secondhand, filtered through Linda and a few mutual acquaintances, and while there was a grim satisfaction in knowing the truth had consequences, it was not the outcome I focused on. My attention was on rebuilding something far more fragile myself. I moved into a small one-bedroom apartment closer to work. Nothing luxurious but clean, bright, and mine. I bought a second-hand couch, a sturdy table and shelves for my books, arranging them without asking permission or bracing for criticism. I resumed full-time hours at my job. My concentration improving noticeably without the constant background tension. Therapy became a regular part of my routine. A space where I learned to name what had happened without minimizing it, to understand how control disguises itself as concern, how fear can coexist with love until one erases the other. Each session peeled back another layer of conditioning, another reflex I no longer needed. The final exchange with David came months later, a brief email acknowledging the settlement and requesting no further contact. I replied with a single sentence confirming receipt and then blocked him everywhere. The silence that followed was not empty. It was restorative. It allowed the truth to settle without interference. The house he had come home to that night had been empty, but the emptiness that followed him was of his own making, a direct consequence of choices he had insisted were reasonable. And as his world contracted under the weight of those choices, mine began slowly and deliberately to expand. By the time I turned 31, my life looked nothing like the future I once tried so desperately to preserve, and yet it felt more stable, more honest than anything I had known during my marriage. My apartment was small, but filled with light, the windows facing east, so the mornings arrived gently, and every object in it existed because I chose it, not because it had been approved or tolerated. The walls were bare at first, then slowly came alive with photographs, framed prints and colors. I loved without explanation. I slept through the night more often than not, my body finally unlearning the vigilance it had practiced for years. Therapy helped me understand how deeply the erosion had gone, how fear does not always arrive screaming. Sometimes it whispers until silence feels normal. I learned to recognize the difference between compromise and surrender, between love and control, and each insight felt like reclaiming a piece of myself that had been misplaced rather than lost. At work, my confidence returned steadily. Colleagues noticed the change before I did, commenting on my focus, my willingness to speak up, my ease in rooms where I had once stayed quiet. I accepted a promotion that would have terrified me before trusting my own judgment again. Instead of waiting for permission that never came outside of work, I rebuilt friendships that had faded during my marriage, not with apologies but with honesty, telling them where I had been and why it had taken so long to come back to myself. They welcomed me without judgment, and that acceptance reinforced a truth. I had struggled to believe I had never been too much. I had simply been in a place that required me to be less. I did not rush into dating, and when I eventually did, I paid attention to how I felt rather than how I was perceived. I noticed whether I felt safe, heard, respected, whether disagreement led to conversation or intimidation. Those markers mattered now in ways they never had before. I thought often about the dinner that had started it all, about Margaret's voice cutting through the room, about David's decision to look away, and I no longer felt the sting of humiliation. What I felt instead was clarity, because that moment had stripped away every illusion I had been clinging to. It had forced me to see the cost of staying, not just in terms of dignity, but in terms of safety and survival. The question people asked most often when they learned what had happened was why I did not leave sooner. And for a long time, that question carried a quiet shame, until I understood that readiness is not a moral failing. It is a process I left when I was able to see the danger clearly, when the weight of evidence outweighed the fear of change, and that timing mattered because it meant I left with my resolve intact, not shattered. I heard through Linda months later that David remained with his mother, that the patterns had repeated, that other relationships had faltered under the same pressure, and while that knowledge once would have filled me with anger, it now felt distant, irrelevant to the life I was building. Their consequences were not mine to carry. The house he came home to. That night had been empty, but what followed was fuller than anything I could have imagined. A life shaped by choice rather than endurance, by self-respect rather than approval. When I look back now, I do not frame my story as one of loss. I frame it as an awakening. I learned that silence can be an act of power, that walking away does not mean you failed, and that sometimes the greatest revenge is not proving someone wrong, but refusing to continue proving yourself at all. The night my husband let his mother humiliate me, he believed he was putting me in my place. Instead, he released me from it, and in choosing to leave, I did not just save myself from what might have come next. I gave myself the chance to live well, on my own terms, and that has made all the difference.